The crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of damp earth as Jake jogged along the familiar route in the outskirts of Seattle. The early morning was quiet, save for the distant hum of cars speeding down the highway and the rhythmic sound of his sneakers tapping against the pavement. He had always enjoyed this time of day. The world felt fresh, unspoiled, as if the city had yet to fully awaken. As he passed by an overgrown patch of grass near the roadside, something unusual caught his attention. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. He slowed his pace, ears straining. A tiny, pitiful mewing, barely audible over the breeze. Jake stopped in his tracks, scanning the area. At first, he saw nothing but tufts of wild grass swaying in the wind. But then, just beside a discarded plastic bottle, he noticed a small, trembling form nestled in the dirt. His breath hitched. It was a kitten, so tiny it could fit in the palm of his hand. Its fur was damp and matted, its body shivering violently against the cold morning air. A surge of urgency shot through him. Dropping to his knees, he reached out hesitantly, afraid his touch might be too rough for the fragile creature. The kitten barely reacted as he carefully scooped it up, cradling it in his hands. It was ice cold, too cold. Jake instinctively pulled off his hoodie, wrapping the kitten securely against his chest. The little thing was so weak, its breaths shallow and erratic. It hadn't even opened its eyes yet. A pang of sadness twisted in his chest. How long had it been lying here, abandoned and alone? His mind raced through options. The nearest animal clinic was a few miles away, and he had no idea if they were even open this early. His own place was closer. That settled it. Jake turned on his heels and ran. His apartment wasn't much, a modest space above the pet store where he worked, but at least it was warm and safe. Kicking the door shut behind him, he rushed to his room and grabbed a towel, gently patting the kitten dry. Its tiny body barely moved, and panic clawed at his throat. "Come on, little one. Stay with me." He hurried to the kitchen, filling a bowl with warm water and grabbing a clean cloth. Dipping it in, he gently dabbed at the kitten's fur, trying to raise its body temperature. He had taken care of animals before, but never something this fragile. This tiny life depended entirely on him now. The kitten let out a faint whimper, barely more than a whisper of sound. It was still alive. Jake grabbed his phone with one hand, while keeping the kitten close with the other. He scrolled through his contacts and quickly dialed Dr. Ellis, the veterinarian who had treated countless pets from the shop. The call went straight to voicemail. "Damn it," he muttered, pacing the small room. He didn't have time to wait. He needed supplies, kitten formula, a syringe for feeding, a heating pad, and fast. Tucking the kitten securely inside his hoodie once more, he grabbed his keys and dashed down the stairs. The pet store was just a block away, and Jake wasted no time unlocking the door. Inside, the familiar scent of hay, kibble, and cedar shavings filled the air. He flipped on the lights, heading straight for the supply section. "Okay, formula, formula," he muttered, scanning the shelves. His fingers landed on a small canister labeled kitten milk replacer. Grabbing it, he rushed to the counter, locating a syringe used for hand-feeding baby animals. With supplies in hand, he ran back home, his heart pounding. The kitten remained eerily still inside his hoodie. He could feel its faint heartbeat against his chest, fragile and uncertain. "Hang in there, buddy." Back in his apartment, he quickly prepared the formula, warming it slightly before filling the syringe. He settled onto the couch, carefully cradling the kitten in one hand, while slowly bringing the tip of the syringe to its mouth. "Come on, you've got to eat." For a long moment, nothing happened. Jake felt his stomach clench, and then a tiny twitch. The kitten's minuscule pink tongue flicked out, latching onto the drop of milk at the tip of the syringe. Relief flooded through him. "That's it. Good job, little one." Slowly, carefully, he fed the kitten, giving it only small amounts at a time to avoid overwhelming its tiny system. It was a delicate process, but he was patient. He had to be. Once the kitten had taken in enough, Jake set the syringe aside and adjusted the towel around it, keeping its small body snug and warm. He could still feel the slight tremors running through its form, but at least now, there was some hope. He leaned back against the couch, exhaling deeply. It wasn't much, But it was a start. As he gazed down at the fragile little creature in his arms, he realized something. This kitten wasn't just fighting for survival. It had already defied the odds, holding on long enough for him to find it. There was strength in something so small, so helpless. A small smile tugged at the corner of Jake's lips. "I think I'll call you Pumpkin," he murmured. The name felt right. The kitten's damp fur, though still a mess, had a faint golden hue, reminiscent of the autumn pumpkins that lined the storefronts this time of year. Pumpkin remained curled against his chest, still weak but no longer alone. And as Jake watched over his new little charge, a quiet determination settled within him. He wasn't going to let Pumpkin down. The vet's office smelled of antiseptic and faint traces of animal fur. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting a sterile glow over the clean, white walls. Jake stood by the examination table, his hoodie still wrapped around the tiny, trembling kitten. His fingers tightened around the fabric as the vet, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes but a gentle touch, carefully unwrapped the small creature from the warmth of the fabric. "Where did you find it?" she asked, her voice professional yet not unkind. "Near the highway," Jake replied. "It was just lying there, freezing. I don't think it's even a day old." The vet frowned as she examined the kitten. Its body was frail, almost weightless in her hands. Its fur, damp from the cold and slightly matted, barely provided any warmth. She pressed a stethoscope gently against its tiny chest and listened for a long moment. Then, she sighed. "This kitten was born prematurely," she said. "Its eyes are still shut, and its limbs are weak. Kittens this small rely on their mother's warmth and milk to survive, but without that, the chances are—" Jake felt his stomach tighten. He had expected bad news, but hearing it out loud still sent a wave of dread through him. "But there's a chance, right? If I take care of it?" The vet hesitated. "It's possible, but difficult. Premature kittens have weak immune systems and struggle to regulate their body temperature. You'll need to feed it every 2 hours, keep it warm, and stimulate it to help with digestion. Even then," she shook her head slightly, "most don't make it." Jake swallowed hard. He knew the vet wasn't trying to be cruel. She was simply stating the truth. But something inside him refused to give up. He looked down at the fragile kitten, its tiny body barely rising and falling with each breath. It had already survived against the odds, alone, in the cold, without its mother. If it had fought this hard to live, how could he not fight for it? "I want to try," he said firmly. "Tell me what to do." The vet studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right," she said. "First, we need to warm it up properly." She handed Jake a small heating pad and showed him how to wrap the kitten in a soft towel before placing it inside a shoebox. "This will help maintain its body heat," she explained. "Keep the temperature stable. Too hot, and it could overheat. Too cold, and its body will shut down." Next, she prepared a small syringe filled with a special kitten milk replacement formula. "You can't feed it regular cow's milk," she warned. "That would make it sick." Jake took the syringe from her, his hands steady despite his nerves. He gently brought the tip to the kitten's tiny mouth, letting a few drops touch its lips. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the kitten's tiny pink tongue flicked out, lapping at the liquid weakly. Jake felt a small surge of hope. "Good," the vet said, watching closely. "Keep feeding it small amounts like this every 2 hours, even through the night. And make sure to help it go to the bathroom. It can't do that on its own yet." Jake raised an eyebrow at that last part. "Wait, what?" The vet smirked slightly. "Mother cats lick their kittens to help them relieve themselves. Since you're taking on that role, you'll have to use a warm, damp cotton ball to stimulate it." Jake blinked. Right. Of course. Despite the daunting list of responsibilities, he felt determined. He had never raised a kitten before, let alone one so vulnerable, but he wasn't going to let this little one die without a fight. Before he left, the vet handed him a small bag with everything he would need: formula, syringes, soft blankets, and a tiny bottle of probiotics to help the kitten's weak stomach. "Come back if you notice anything strange," she said. "But be prepared. This will be exhausting, and even with all your effort, it still might not survive." Jake nodded, but his resolve didn't waver. "I understand." Back at his apartment, Jake transformed his small coffee table into an emergency kitten care station. He placed the shoebox near the couch, where he could easily check on it throughout the night. A soft ticking clock sat nearby, mimicking the sound of a mother cat's heartbeat. He sat on the floor, watching the kitten sleep, its tiny body curled into a warm nest of blankets. It was still so weak, its breathing barely audible, but it was alive. For the next few hours, Jake followed the vet's instructions to the letter. Every 2 hours, he carefully fed the kitten through the syringe, making sure not to overfeed it. He rubbed its belly gently after each meal, mimicking a mother's care. When it squeaked softly in protest, he chuckled despite himself. "Pumpkin," he murmured, staring at the soft, golden fur that reminded him of autumn leaves and warm pumpkin spice. The name fit. As the hours stretched into the night, exhaustion crept in. Jake fought to keep his eyes open, but the constant feeding schedule was draining. Every time his alarm rang, he forced himself up, even when his limbs felt like lead. He had never pulled an all-nighter for something like this before. But somehow, as he cradled the tiny life in his hands, it felt like the most important thing he had ever done. By dawn, Pumpkin had made it through the night. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a guarantee of survival. But it was something. And for Jake, that was enough to keep fighting. The first rays of sunlight seeped through the blinds of Jake's apartment, casting soft golden streaks across the room. He blinked the sleep from his eyes, stretching his sore muscles as he reached for the shoebox beside him. A part of him feared the worst, that Pumpkin's tiny body would be still and cold. But when he peeled back the blanket, a soft, weak meow greeted him. Relief crashed over Jake like a wave. "Hey, little fighter," he murmured, gently stroking the kitten's fragile body. Pumpkin felt a little warmer, its breathing steadier than the night before. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The past 24 hours had been the most exhausting of Jake's life. He had barely slept, waking up every 2 hours to feed the kitten, monitor its body temperature, and ensure it was still breathing. His alarm had become his most hated enemy, jolting him awake just as his body surrendered to exhaustion. But every time he looked at Pumpkin, so small and vulnerable, he knew he couldn't stop now. Stretching, he reached for the syringe filled with kitten formula and coaxed it to Pumpkin's mouth. The tiny creature hesitated before weakly latching onto the tip, its little pink tongue lapping up the warm milk drop by drop. It wasn't much, but it was something. "You're a stubborn one, huh?" Jake chuckled, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think I like that." As the hours turned into days, Pumpkin grew stronger. Bit by bit, fight by fight. Jake took the kitten everywhere with him. He had no choice. Leaving Pumpkin alone for too long wasn't an option, not when it needed round-the-clock care. So he tucked the shoebox into a canvas bag and brought it with him to work at the pet store. His boss, an older woman named Linda, raised an eyebrow when she saw him setting up a heating pad in the break room. "You really took in a newborn?" she asked, arms crossed but amusement glinting in her eyes. Jake shrugged, carefully checking the temperature inside the shoebox. "Didn't really think about it. Just couldn't leave it there." Linda huffed but didn't argue. "You've got a good heart, kid." Throughout the day, Jake stole quick breaks to check on Pumpkin. He fed it in between helping customers, cradling the kitten in one hand while typing inventory numbers with the other. A few customers noticed and asked questions, some even offering advice. One elderly woman, a longtime customer, beamed at him and said, "You remind me of my grandson, always bringing home strays." Jake found himself smiling more than he had in a long time. One evening, 4 days after he found Pumpkin, something incredible happened. Jake was sitting on his couch, absent-mindedly scrolling through his phone while Pumpkin napped in his lap. The tiny kitten, still smaller than the palm of his hand, had just finished another meal and was curled up in a warm little ball. Then, a soft noise broke the silence. Jake glanced down, heart skipping a beat. Pumpkin was stirring, its tiny paws twitching. Then, slowly, its eyes fluttered open for the first time. 2 round, cloudy blue eyes blinked up at him. Jake inhaled sharply, his chest tightening. "Holy crap," he whispered. "You did it, little guy." Pumpkin's first sight was probably blurry, but it didn't seem to matter. The kitten let out a small, curious meow, stretching its tiny legs as it wobbled uncertainly. Jake laughed, unable to stop the warmth spreading through his chest. He reached out, gently stroking the top of Pumpkin's head. The kitten leaned into the touch, its tail flicking weakly. It was such a small moment, just a kitten opening its eyes. But to Jake, it felt like a miracle. "You're a tough little thing," he murmured. "Guess we're stuck with each other now, huh?" Pumpkin meowed again, as if agreeing. Jake had no idea what the future held for the tiny creature in his hands. The vet had warned him that the hardest battles were still ahead. Pumpkin's immune system was fragile, and the risk of infections or sudden complications was still dangerously high. But at that moment, as he held the little kitten close, he decided he wouldn't think about that. Not now. For now, Pumpkin was here, alive, and that was enough. The first week of caring for Pumpkin had been a relentless battle, but Jake had started to believe that the worst was behind them. The tiny kitten had opened its eyes, begun to recognize his voice, and even managed to wobble around inside its shoebox, though its legs were still weak. Every milestone, no matter how small, filled Jake with a sense of pride and relief. But life had a way of striking when you least expected it. One morning, just as Jake was starting to feel a semblance of routine, he woke up to find Pumpkin oddly still. His heart slammed against his ribs as he reached for the kitten, gently shaking its tiny body. "Pumpkin," he whispered, voice tight with panic. The kitten didn't respond. Its body was warm, too warm. Dread coiled in Jake's stomach as he touched Pumpkin's forehead. Even without a thermometer, he knew. Fever. "No, no, no," he muttered, scooping the tiny creature into his hands. Its breathing was shallow, its little limbs limp. The kitten had been fine just hours ago. How had everything gone so wrong so fast? Jake didn't waste another second. He grabbed his jacket, shoved Pumpkin into the soft blanket inside the shoebox, and bolted out the door. The vet clinic felt even colder than usual. Dr. Carter, the same vet who had first examined Pumpkin, quickly took the kitten from Jake's trembling hands. She barely spoke as she worked, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. Jake stood frozen near the examination table, his fists clenched at his sides. His mind raced with everything he could have done wrong. Had he not fed Pumpkin enough? Had he let the room get too cold? Too hot? He had been so careful, so determined to keep the kitten safe. And yet, here they were. Dr. Carter finally looked up, her expression unreadable. "Pumpkin has an infection," she said. "Newborn kittens have almost no immune system. Even with all your care, it was always a risk." Jake's chest tightened. Is it bad?" The vet sighed. "It's serious. Possibly septicemia, blood poisoning. I won't lie to you, Jake. We're at a dangerous point. If the infection spreads too much..." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. Jake swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Dr. Carter explained the options: aggressive antibiotic treatment, fluids, and round-the-clock monitoring. But then she mentioned something that made Jake's stomach drop. "The treatment is expensive," she admitted, "and it's not guaranteed to work." Jake didn't hesitate. "I don't care about the cost. Do whatever you have to do." Dr. Carter studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, we'll start immediately." The next 24 hours were the longest of Jake's life. He wasn't allowed to stay overnight at the clinic, but he didn't go home either. Instead, he sat in his car in the parking lot, staring blankly at his phone, unable to focus on anything. He had never felt so helpless. Linda called at some point, asking why he hadn't shown up for work. When he explained, she simply said, "Stay with your kitten. We'll cover for you." It was such a small kindness, but it nearly broke him. The next morning, as soon as the clinic opened, Jake was inside, practically running to the reception desk. Dr. Carter met him with an exhausted look. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Then she smiled. "Pumpkin made it through the night." Jake let out a shaky breath, gripping the edge of the counter to steady himself. "And the infection?" "We're not out of the woods yet," she admitted. "But the antibiotics are working. The fever is starting to go down." Jake sagged against the counter, relief making his legs weak. He didn't even care that his eyes were burning with unshed tears. "Can I see him?" he asked. Dr. Carter led him to the back, where Pumpkin lay inside a small incubator, hooked up to tiny 4 tubes. The kitten looked impossibly small, even more fragile than before. But when Jake pressed his hand against the glass, Pumpkin's ear twitched slightly. "You're a fighter," Jake whispered. "Just hold on a little longer." For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to hope. Jake had never been more exhausted in his life. For 3 days straight, he barely left the vet clinic. When he wasn't allowed inside, he sat in his car, waiting for updates. When the clinic permitted him visits, he stayed by Pumpkin's side, whispering words of encouragement as if the tiny kitten could understand. Pumpkin remained weak but stable. The antibiotics were helping, but the battle wasn't over yet. Dr. Carter warned him that Kitten's and Pumpkin's condition could relapse at any moment. The infection might subside today, but return stronger tomorrow. Jake hated the uncertainty. On the 4th day, he was finally allowed to hold Pumpkin again. The kitten was still hooked up to N4, but when Jake cradled him in his hands, Pumpkin let out the softest, most fragile meow. Jake's chest tightened. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, gently rubbing the tiny spot between Pumpkin's ears. "You scared the hell out of me. You know that?" Pumpkin blinked up at him with cloudy blue eyes, his little pink nose twitching. "He's lucky to have you," Dr. Carter said as she watched them. Jake scoffed. "I don't know about that. I feel like I've been doing everything wrong." The vet shook her head. "If that were true, he wouldn't still be here." She paused before adding, "Not everyone would go this far for a kitten, Jake. You've done more for him than most people would." Jake looked down at the fragile life in his hands. He had never thought about it that way. He just knew that the moment he found Pumpkin on the side of the road, leaving him hadn't been an option. And now, that tiny decision had turned his whole world upside down. Later that day, Dr. Carter sat him down to discuss the next step. "He's getting better, but he's still not out of danger," she said. "He'll need continued antibiotics, careful feeding, and constant monitoring." She hesitated. "And the treatment so far, it's already expensive." Jake tensed. He knew where this was going. Dr. Carter sighed. "I know money is tight, and there are rescues that specialize in neonatal kittens. If you want, I can reach out to one. They have more resources, and Pumpkin would still get good care." The thought of handing Pumpkin over made Jake's stomach churn. It made sense. He wasn't a vet. He wasn't a rescue worker. He was just a guy who worked at a pet store, barely making enough to cover rent. But the idea of saying goodbye? He looked at Pumpkin, curled up in the incubator, so small and vulnerable. He had fought too hard for this kitten to walk away now. "I'll take care of him," Jake said firmly. Dr. Carter studied him. "Are you sure? It's a big commitment." Jake nodded. "I'm sure." The next few days passed in a blur of exhaustion and stress. Jake took Pumpkin home with a bag full of medication, a strict feeding schedule, and a head full of worries. He set up a small nursery area in his apartment, a heating pad, blankets, and a soft plushie for Pumpkin to snuggle against. The first night back home was rough. Pumpkin was restless, letting out weak little meows that broke Jake's heart. He checked the kitten's temperature every hour, terrified the fever would return. He barely slept, jolting awake at the slightest sound. But by morning, Pumpkin was still breathing. And the morning after that, he seemed just a little stronger. Day by day, the fragile kitten fought his way back to life. One week after bringing Pumpkin home, Jake noticed a change. The tiny creature, once so weak he could barely lift his head, had started wobbling around his little makeshift bed. His legs were unsteady, and sometimes he flopped onto his side, but he kept trying. Jake watched, equal parts amused and emotional. "You're really not giving up, huh?" Pumpkin meowed in response and, with great effort, took another step. Jake grinned. "That's my boy." The kitten had come so close to death, yet here he was, alive, fighting, determined. Jake wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, Pumpkin had stopped being just a stray he had rescued. He was family, and no matter what, Jake wasn't going to let him go. Jake had never been so hyper-aware of another living being before. Every twitch of Pumpkin's tiny body, every sound he made, every rise and fall of his breath, it all kept Jake on edge. He had spent too many sleepless nights terrified that the kitten would relapse, that he would wake up to find Pumpkin cold and lifeless. But as the days passed, those fears began to ease. Pumpkin was growing stronger. It started with little things. The way he held his head up for longer periods. The way his tiny paws, once weak and shaky, now pushed against Jake's fingers when he fed him. And then, one day, something happened that made Jake's heart nearly burst with joy. Pumpkin played. It wasn't much, just a tiny, uncoordinated swat at a loose thread on Jake's hoodie. But it was something. Jake laughed, a real, genuine laugh, for the first time in what felt like forever. "Oh, you like that, huh?" he murmured, wiggling the thread again. Pumpkin batted at it, his little tail twitching. It was such a simple moment, but to Jake, it felt like a miracle. Pumpkin was no longer just surviving, he was thriving. His fur had become fluffier, his once cloudy blue eyes now bright and alert. He had started wobbling around Jake's apartment with more confidence, his tiny paws making soft patting sounds against the wooden floor. One morning, Jake woke up to find Pumpkin sitting beside him on the pillow, staring at him with an expectant look. "Dude, it's 6 in the morning," Jake groaned, rubbing his face. Pumpkin meowed. Jake sighed but smiled, reaching over to scratch the kitten's head. All right, I get it. You're the boss." He got up, went through the now familiar routine of feeding and cleaning up after Pumpkin, and watched as the tiny creature devoured his meal with a level of enthusiasm that made Jake proud. "You're not that helpless little guy anymore, huh?" he murmured. Pumpkin looked up at him, licking his tiny nose, before pouncing. Well, attempting to pounce, onto Jake's shoelaces. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a menace." But he wouldn't have it any other way. Even though Pumpkin seemed healthier than ever, Jake still worried. So, when the 2-week checkup with Dr. Carter arrived, he was both eager and anxious to hear what she had to say. The moment she saw Pumpkin, she raised an eyebrow. "Well, someone's been eating well." Jake grinned. "He's got an appetite, that's for sure." Dr. Carter performed a thorough exam, checking Pumpkin's weight, heartbeat, and reflexes. The whole time, the kitten wiggled and protested in his tiny, squeaky meows, much to Jake's amusement. Finally, the vet stepped back with a small smile. "He's doing incredibly well. Honestly, I didn't think he'd make it, but you proved me wrong." Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "So he's okay?" Dr. Carter nodded. "He's more than okay. He's a survivor." Pumpkin, as if understanding the moment, let out a triumphant little chirp. Jake laughed, scooping the kitten into his arms. "That's right, buddy. You showed them." Dr. Carter gave him a knowing look. "So, have you thought about what's next?" Jake hesitated. He knew what she was really asking. Would he keep Pumpkin, or would he try to find him a home? At first, the idea of keeping the kitten hadn't even been on the table. His life wasn't exactly ideal for a pet. He worked long hours, barely made enough money to cover rent, and had never imagined himself as a cat person. But looking down at Pumpkin, purring in his arms, the answer was clear. Jake smiled. "He's already home." Dr. Carter nodded in approval. "Then I think you just got yourself a lifelong best friend." Back at the apartment, Jake sat on the couch, watching as Pumpkin chased an invisible enemy across the floor. His once fragile legs were now strong and steady, his little body full of life and energy. Jake couldn't believe how much had changed in just a few weeks. Pumpkin wasn't the only one who had been saved. Somewhere in the chaos of those sleepless nights, in the desperation of fighting for Pumpkin's life, Jake had found something he didn't even realize he was missing, a purpose. He had saved Pumpkin, but in a way, Pumpkin had saved him, too. As the kitten finally tired himself out and curled up beside him, Jake reached down, running a gentle hand over the soft fur. "You're stuck with me now, buddy," he murmured. Pumpkin let out a sleepy little purr in response. Jake smiled. For the first time in a long time, everything felt right. Life with Pumpkin had settled into a routine. Each morning, Jake woke up to the tiny ball of fluff climbing onto his chest, demanding breakfast with his insistent meows. Every evening, Pumpkin curled up beside him as he read or watched TV, his soft purring filling the apartment with warmth. Jake had never imagined himself as a cat person, but now, he couldn't picture life without Pumpkin. And that's what made the next decision so difficult. One afternoon, while Jake was at work, a familiar face walked into the pet store. Emily and her daughter, Sophie, were regular customers. Sophie, a bright-eyed girl of about 8, was absolutely obsessed with cats. Every time they visited, she would make a beeline for the adoption center, pressing her nose against the glass of the kitten enclosures. But today, instead of heading for the kittens, Sophie came straight to Jake. "Jake," she said excitedly, "Mom said I can adopt a kitty. A real one this time." Emily chuckled. "We've been thinking about it for a while. Sophie's been very responsible with our neighbor's cat, and we think she's finally ready." Jake smiled, ruffling the girl's hair. "That's great, kiddo. Have you looked at the kittens we have here?" Sophie nodded. "Yeah, but," she hesitated, then looked up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. "Mom told me about your kitty, the one you saved. Can I meet him?" Jake's smile froze. Pumpkin. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He glanced at Emily, who gave him an apologetic smile. "She told me about Pumpkin a while back," she explained. "I wasn't going to say anything, but Sophie hasn't stopped talking about him. If you're thinking about finding him a home, we'd love to meet him." Jake's heart clenched. Pumpkin did deserve the best home possible, a place where he'd have all the attention and love in the world. He had never planned on keeping the kitten forever. He just wanted to save him. And Sophie? She would love him in a way that only a child could. But could Jake really say goodbye? That night, Jake sat on the couch, Pumpkin curled up in his lap. He ran his fingers through the kitten's soft fur, his mind swirling with thoughts. Keeping Pumpkin had never been his original plan. He had only wanted to help. And now that he had, shouldn't he do what was best for him? Sophie would be the perfect owner. But as he looked down at the sleeping kitten, memories flooded his mind. The night he found Pumpkin, cold and helpless. The sleepless nights, feeding him drop by drop. The fear of losing him. The relief when he had survived. Pumpkin wasn't just some rescue kitten. He was his. Jake sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "What do I do, buddy?" he muttered. Pumpkin stretched in his sleep, one tiny paw pressing against Jake's chest. Jake closed his eyes. He already knew the answer. The next morning, Jake invited Emily and Sophie over to meet Pumpkin. Sophie was practically vibrating with excitement when she saw the tiny kitten. "Oh my gosh, he's so cute," she squealed, sitting cross-legged on the floor as Pumpkin sniffed at her fingers. Pumpkin, true to his curious nature, immediately climbed onto her lap. Sophie giggled, stroking his fur gently. "He's perfect," she whispered. Jake forced a smile. "He's a special one, that's for sure." Emily watched him carefully. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. "We don't want you to feel pressured." Jake swallowed hard. "I just want what's best for him." And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't him. After an hour of playing, Sophie finally looked up, her eyes shining. "Can we take him home today?" Jake hesitated. His heart felt like it was being ripped in two. But he nodded. "Yeah," he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Yeah, I think you can." Saying goodbye was harder than he had expected. As he placed Pumpkin into Sophie's arms, the kitten meowed, his tiny claws gripping Jake's shirt for just a second longer than usual. Jake pressed a kiss to the top of Pumpkin's head. "Be good, okay?" he whispered. Pumpkin blinked up at him, then turned to nuzzle against Sophie's chest. And just like that, he was gone. Jake stood at the doorway, watching as Emily and Sophie walked to their car, Pumpkin safely tucked in a carrier. Sophie waved excitedly, and Jake managed a small wave back. As they drove away, a strange emptiness settled in his chest. For weeks, his life had revolved around that tiny kitten. Now, his apartment felt too quiet, too still. He had done the right thing. So why did it feel so wrong? 2 days later, Jake's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Emily. Pumpkin's doing great. Sophie renamed him Sunny because he makes her so happy. She wanted to send you this. Attached was a picture. Sophie, lying on her bed, hugging Pumpkin. Sunny, against her chest. The kitten looked completely content, his tiny paws curled up, his eyes closed in bliss. Jake stared at the photo for a long time. Maybe this was how it was meant to be. Pumpkin had needed him once. Now, someone else needed Pumpkin. And as much as it hurt, that was okay. Jake smiled softly, typing back a reply. Tell her she picked the perfect name. The apartment felt different without Pumpkin. Jake had never thought of himself as someone who got attached easily, but waking up without the familiar weight of the tiny kitten on his chest was strange. The quiet was unnerving. No tiny paws scrambling across the floor. No insistent meows demanding breakfast. Just silence. For the first few days, he found himself instinctively glancing toward the little corner where Pumpkin's bed had been. He even caught himself reaching for the kitten's food bowl before remembering it was no longer needed. It was a hollow feeling. He knew he had done the right thing. He told himself he had done the right thing. Then why did it feel like something was missing? Jake threw himself into work, hoping that keeping busy would help. At the pet store, he found himself drawn to the adoption center more often than usual. He helped clean the enclosures, played with the kittens, and answered customers' questions. But none of them were Pumpkin. One afternoon, as he was restocking cat food, his manager, Greg, nudged him. You doing okay, man? Jake blinked. Huh. Greg raised an eyebrow. I know you got attached to that little guy. Jake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, it's just weird, you know? I got used to having him around. Greg smirked. Sounds like someone's turning into a cat person. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. I guess so. Greg crossed his arms. So what's stopping you from adopting another one? Jake hesitated. He had considered it. But every time he thought about bringing home another kitten, it felt wrong. Pumpkin wasn't just any cat. He was his cat, his little fighter, his tiny miracle. Replacing him wasn't an option. A week after saying goodbye to Pumpkin, Jake was locking up the store when his phone buzzed. Emily. Hey, we're in the area. Sophie wanted to stop by and see you. We have a little surprise. Jake's heart skipped a beat. A few minutes later, the familiar SUV pulled up, and Sophie practically jumped out of the car, grinning from ear to ear. Jake barely had time to greet her before she thrust something soft into his arms. Pumpkin, or Sunny, as he was now called. The kitten had grown a little in just a week. His fur was fluffier, his eyes even brighter. But the moment Jake held him, Sunny let out a familiar little chirp and rubbed his tiny head against Jake's chest. Jake swallowed hard. Hey, buddy, he whispered, running a gentle hand over the kitten's fur. Sophie beamed. He remembers you. Emily smiled warmly. Of course he does. You saved his life. Jake looked down at the kitten, who was now happily kneading his hoodie. So, what's the surprise? Sophie giggled. We wanted to let you babysit him for the weekend. Mom and I are visiting my grandma, and I didn't want to leave Sunny alone. So I told Mom, Jake's the best cat dad ever. He can take care of him. Jake blinked. Wait, you want me to watch him? Emily nodded. Only if you want to. Sophie insisted that if anyone should babysit Sunny, it should be you. Jake's heart clenched. He looked down at the little kitten curled up in his arms, purring like a tiny motor. He missed him more than he realized. And for the first time in days, the emptiness inside him faded just a little. That night, the apartment finally felt right again. Sunny wasted no time making himself at home, jumping onto the couch, chasing shadows on the floor, and curling up next to Jake just like old times. As Jake lay in bed, he felt the familiar warmth of a tiny body pressing against him. He smiled, reaching down to scratch behind Sunny's ears. You happy, buddy? He murmured. Sunny let out a soft, content meow. Jake sighed. Yeah, me too. For the first time since saying goodbye, he felt at peace. He had saved Pumpkin's life. He had given him a chance to have a family, to be loved. And even though it hurt to let him go, it was worth it. Because now, Pumpkin, Sunny, was happy. And that was all that mattered. When Sophie and Emily returned to pick up Sunny, Jake felt a strange sense of closure. Sophie hugged him tightly. "Thank you for taking care of him, Jake." Jake smiled. "Anytime, kiddo." As he handed Sunny back, the kitten let out a tiny protest, pawing at Jake's hoodie. Jake chuckled, pressing one last kiss to his furry head. "Be good, okay?" Emily gave Jake a knowing look. "You know, if you ever want to adopt another cat, I think you'd be a great pet parent." Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe someday." As they drove away, Jake stood there for a moment, watching until the car disappeared from sight. Then, he took a deep breath and turned back toward the pet store. There were plenty of animals out there that needed someone. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to help again.